So welcome everyone to the end of this amazing 2.5 days of programming. I have to say that when I first saw that I was the closing piece, I was a little worried, but now I realized that it was the perfect position for me to talk about what we want to do to be ready for disasters. Why? Because you have had opportunity to see and hear all of the amazing presentations that have come the past 2 days and also this morning. You have seen what ICRAM is doing. You have seen what individual countries are doing, what individual institutions have done to prepare for disasters and to recover from disasters. Much harder to do. So we have learned, I hope, about and been inspired by these many, many talks. So now it is time for you to get ready to start your process to prepare for the disaster, because whether you have been involved with the last year's earthquake, whether you have been involved in flooding, with this pandemic, all of it is going to move forward. And we know that eventually there will be another disaster. We know that when we can recover and it all seems good and we can move forward and be happy, that we still need to prepare for the next crisis, because we don't know when it will happen, but we do know that it will happen. And so this conference has been a wonderful way to give you, the participants, many ideas to see what has been done across many different sectors, across museums, libraries, archives, across countries, across continents. And so now, please be energized to think about what you want to do next. So we want to talk about risk. And you have been learning about risk. And I highly, highly recommend this ICRAM publication, which is free for download, to help you in preparing for thinking about risk management and preparing for the next risk. Because what you want to do with risk management is to look to the future. Now, I don't mean to be negative about the fact that there will be another disaster. No, I want to be positive. If we know it's coming, we can prepare. And that's what you want to do. That's what we want all cultural heritage institutions to do, to help to prepare for that next crisis, so that collections, buildings, and most of all, most important, people are all saved. Now, when we look at risk is something that is coming into the future and is something that is a change in your normal work. It is a possibility for damage. Risk is what you want to manage to reduce the risk. And by looking at and identifying what the risks are, that is the way to mitigate or lessen the impact. So that is what we're going to be talking about for the next hour and a bit more. So, in each institution where you might be working, or wherever you work, there are a variety of risks. And you need to consider which are the highest risk for you. And then you need to think about, can I reduce that risk? can I eliminate that risk? Or if there's nothing I can do about that risk, then where should I put my resources otherwise? So if we look at this chart to see whether there are all of these, let's go through them just one at a time. I'm going to start at the top with the physical forces. So physical forces could, of course, be a riot, could be damage from an earthquake, could be a building or that collapses. Any of those, what is the likelihood that that would happen to you? Disassociation is something that there's a great, that is very possible to control. Dissociation means that the identifying information about an object or a piece, an item in your collection is separated from the piece so you can no longer find it. Now, how does that happen? It could be that it gets misshelved. If it has its proper location and it's not in that proper location, then you may not be able to find it. So disassociation is very important in terms of inventory, to know what you have and then to know where it is located. And that's something that's done with databases, with cataloging, with metadata, whether you have a card catalog, a paper catalog, or whether you have an electronic one. All of that information is very important to retain and to make sure you have backup copies that are located off-site so that in the event of an earthquake, for example, you have access to an electronic copy of all of your material inventory. Now, we talked just the program before, the workshop before this one about storage, talked about incorrect relative humidity. Moisture can, of course, cause mold and damage in many different ways. Also incorrect temperature, and they are very closely related. In one of the earlier programs from yesterday, it was pointed out that in conservation, most often the issues that are brought forward are humidity and temperature. Those, of course, are not the only threats. Also, light, and whether or not you have enough light or whether or not you have UV protection. Now we know that for many objects, light can be damaging. Light can age in the same way that if we are in the sun too much, we get wrinkles faster. If we stay out of the sun or protect our skin, then our skin stays more youthful. This is true also for all of our collections. It's particularly true for some pieces. So paper, photographs, textiles are much more sensitive to aging from light and incorrect temperature and humidity as well than, say, glass or pottery. And yet all of those things also age. Anything that's organic will age. Now, if we look at pollutants, that also is an aging and can leave a film or leave something on top of either your building and making it so that it's not safe to breathe, for example, or leave something on the materials where those pollutants cause a crusting or a darkening of the original material. Now, when we talk about pests, we can be talking about insects or rodents, and those are all possibilities for damage because they use materials to make their nests or to eat, and they also their feces can, of course, be a pollutant on the materials. Water, in the same way that humidity is not good, but water coming onto objects can be extremely damaging. When you have a fire, you almost always have water. If you don't have water, then you often don't have a collection any longer. And we've seen this happen in some of the terrible fires that have occurred in the last number of years, Notre Dame being one that comes readily to mind. Criminals, and I wanted to leave this for last, is of course a real problem in war-torn countries where theft of materials or the destruction of materials to resell in order to fund activity, whether it's criminals or whether it's terrorism, collections, the importance of security for collections to avoid that problem is very, very important. So if you're storing materials temporarily after a disaster, such as the earthquake that happened a year ago in Croatia, you need a place to store them temporarily, but that's also secure, so that you know that there is not theft of your rare materials in your collections. So if we're looking at what happens in an emergency, it's something that's going to threaten the normal operations and conditions in your institution. Now, in your institution, you would be, in theory, you can have a normal operation where you're monitoring your collections through doing good security, you're providing a good environment, you are cleaning, you have safe location for your materials, and you are exhibiting them and either doing them open for the public or such as now in the pandemic, you're providing video or other means to share your collections. This is familiar, I'm sure, to many of you. Looking at the earthquake here that we see down below, you can see the shaking and the damage, and then the extreme and how much damage happened. And the color shows that from the center, and where in Zagreb and other cities in the area here were all exposed to damage because of the earthquake. Now we know that other earthquakes will follow, and there was a wonderful presentation, I believe yesterday, or maybe it was Thursday, of the civil engineering that was going on, and the prediction and thinking about what they were going to do. Having cultural heritage be part of working with the civil protection agencies within the city, within the region, within the province, however that is organized, is really important. And that came through very much in the presentations that happened both on Thursday and Friday. So, this was the earthquake. What are the biggest threats to your collection and building now? This is the past. This is what happened. This was an earthquake that damaged so much. And now, a year later, there has been a great deal of cleanup, but it's not over yet. There are still many more things to be done to bring the cities and the collections back to a more normal situation. But is this the biggest threat now to your building? Or will this be something that will happen more in the future? And so the risk assessment, what are the biggest threats to the collections and the building, needs to be done along a timeline. What is my greatest threat in the next week, in the next year, in the next 5 years? What do I need to do to think about that threat and the assessment to put it on a timeline, not only by how severe the risk is, but also the likelihood of it happening. And so creating a timeline can be very, very useful. So disasters can cause a great deal of loss or a small amount of loss. It depends upon what the disaster is and how prepared you are. So having emergency plans, thinking about worst case scenarios in advance can be extremely helpful for bringing staff together at all levels to do that planning and to do training so that, and we learned about this in the previous 2 days as well, so that you know what to do, so that you know, even if you don't anticipate that particular disaster, you can be thinking about preparedness and recovery. When I get into a plane, and I used to get into a plane to travel, I always look to see where the emergency exit was. Now, I have never flown on a plane where there has been a problem. That said, I do know that on a plane, when there is a problem, the majority of people who live through the disaster, if there's a crash, are the ones who know where the emergency exit is and who go to it immediately. The first people to use the emergency exits are the people who are most likely to live in a crash. And so it takes very little time to look at where that emergency exit is. And that's what I'm talking about in terms of something larger, to think ahead. What is the worst case scenario and what am I going to do in that worst case scenario? If it's on a plane, I know where I'm going to go to the closest emergency exit, and I know whether it's behind me or in front of me. In the same way that they tell you to think about that, very few people do that. I always do. Because I know that those people who did that in the past who were in a crash were the ones who lived to tell the story. So now, if you're thinking about a disaster and how to lessen the effects of it, let us think in advance to think worst case scenario, but it's not just about you. You may have been assigned to do this work. You may feel that it is your responsibility because you are in preservation or you're in collections, or that's your job, is to take care of the collections. But all the staff need to be involved with the planning and the training. All the staff are going to be asked to help in the event of a disaster. And so having them all on board, as it were, having them all know what would be expected and know how they could do various jobs in a disaster recovery situation. Very important. And to use the staff to help decide what are the risks. And if you look at your facilities people, the people who clean, the people who open the building and who close the building, those staff are the people who often have the very best ideas in terms of accurate risk assessment, and who can offer suggestions for what could be done to improve the situation. Preventative measures for maintenance mapping out your building, thinking about what you can do. And the very best training is actually having small disasters that you have to take action with. And that helps prepare staff and you yourself for larger disasters. So what are some of the things that can be done to decrease the risk of loss? If we look at human factors, it's really useful to see what you can do. And again, having the staff help you look at what are the human possibility, the human elements. What are the preventive maintenance that can be done? What in housekeeping could be done to improve the situation to avoid tripping hazards, for example, or housekeeping to make sure that the areas are clean. If you have items, it was said earlier today and also in earlier presentations that storage is a real problem for cultural heritage. There's never enough space for all the collections that are held and for future collections that are coming in. But it's very important not to leave materials on the floor, not to put them in stairwells, not to create a hazard for removing things in the event of emergency. So leaving things on a storage loading dock or leaving things in hallways, whether they're boxed or not, is still a hazard should you need to be able to remove damaged materials quickly. So let's think about, there are really 4 pieces to emergency planning: preparedness, response, recovery, and then mitigation. And mitigation is the first piece. What can we do to lessen the effects of a disaster? And how can we be prepared when that event is going to happen? And how will we know that we do the right response? How can we be ready to respond in a disaster? And recovery is something that takes time. Those of you who have been in the earthquake zone know that a year after, you still are not done with the recovery of materials. So thinking about and preparing yourself and staying energized and positive is so important for all disaster situations. To think about the preparedness, that we're ready, that we know what we're going to do. We've practiced. And practice, of course, they say, practice makes perfect. And that's exactly, well, maybe you don't have a perfect response, but you'll have a much better response and a better recovery if you've thought about it ahead of time, if you've mitigated or reduced the possibilities that are available to you, and if you are prepared by practice, by having written process, and by involving not only your staff, but of course, the outside people as well. Involving the city, the fire department, the civil service recovery is so important when you're looking at a disaster, whether it's a large disaster, such as the earthquake where there were multiple buildings, or whether it's a disaster that's just affecting your institution. And the recovery and the preparedness for those different kinds of scenarios is very, very different. We'll talk about that a little bit. So another really good resource is the Canadian Conservation Center. They have available for free, also through the ICCROM, a guide to risk management of cultural heritage. They have agents of deterioration and then ways to mitigate that, and to think about ahead of time what those agents of deterioration are, what the possible disasters are. Are you in a flood zone? You're not in a flood zone. If you're up on a mountain, you don't have to worry about a flood, but you may need to worry about water coming in through a roof or a tornado. Or maybe you're not in a tornado zone. Maybe you don't have wind, but maybe you could have conflict. Those are the situations that you need to think about. What are my highest risks? And here's a way to look at that. Again, this is from that same freely downloadable information from ICCROM. So we talked about the physical forces, criminals. We looked at that in that circular piece. But here now is a chart where you can do that. You can print this out, or you can do it electronically to look at. Are these going to be rare events, common events, and the cumulative process? So let's think about rare events. Earthquakes you might think of as rare events, but with very, very important damage, where the physical forces of this rare event of an earthquake can be devastating. Now, if we think about common events, where maybe it's a leaking bathroom or a leaking pipe, where we can use the staff who come in and turn on the lights, and maybe have a regular process of walking through collection areas to make sure that there isn't any water accumulation or anything that we see for damage. Cleaning people, the people who do the maintenance, the facilities, the people who open the building, the people who close the building, they are the eyes of the collections. They are the collection's voice. If they see something, they should say something to the people who can make changes. Now, the cumulative processes that we're talking about can also, that would be, high humidity over time, for example, that would be one thing. Or pests, cumulative processes where the damage is shown in accumulation. It's a little bit at a time, but if it's not identified, it can accumulate to serious damage. So now we talked about preparedness, and we're going to go back to training a little bit later on. But now let's talk a little bit about response. Response is the first thing you do after a disaster. And what is that? You will want to evaluate damage and then come up with your plan. Now, you already have an emergency plan because we've talked about that in preparedness. And I know that if you don't have one now, after this conference, you're going to go back to your institution and start working on it. Yes, you have other duties for your job. And yes, having a disaster plan is so very, very important. Do not put it on the bottom of your pile to-do list. So now if we think about response, that's going to be what you are already thinking about and preparing for. Now, in some cases, you can have a response before the actual disaster. So for example, I work with a small institution that's in Hawaii. Now, Hawaii has a lot of rain. and they have a rainy season. And in this small institution, where they actually rent space, so they can't always control how the quality of their roof, shall I say, they know that if there's going to be heavy rainstorm predicted, they cover their most valuable collections with plastic sheeting to protect it. Now, they do this before every big storm. And in particular, of course, they would want to do it if on a Friday there is a prediction for a storm over the weekend. If they're not in on the weekend, then they want to make sure that their collections are protected from severe water coming in on them. And they know, because they've looked at this and they've done their emergency plan, that the water is going to come from above. It's probably not going to flood because of the location of their storage. So what do? They respond ahead of time. To why? To mitigate the damage should there be that disaster. And then their response is going to be easier because now they may have water that's come in and leaking, and they may have to move those collections, but the collections aren't soaked. Now, there is available in many various languages a disaster mitigation wheel. This one is in English. This was first created through FEMA. And I have to say, I'm very lucky to have been in the planning for this original wheel. The idea was not mine, but I was able to help acquire funding to get it printed in English in the United States. But it is available in many, many different languages and used across the world. So you can look at the website to see whether or not it's available in your language. And if it's not available in your language, you can request to do translation. And that doesn't cost anything. In fact, AIC welcomes the opportunity to get this mitigation disaster wheel translated into useful languages for any language where there is the need. And can I ask, are there any countries that don't have disasters and don't have cultural heritage, so they wouldn't need to think about what to do in the event of a disaster? Probably not. So having it in Spanish, in Portuguese, in Persian, in Japanese, in Chinese, in Croatian, in French, in any language. There are many translations that have already been done. And as I said, getting it translated into your language, if it's not available, is something that is encouraged. So I would encourage you to do that. Now, there's another very useful response plan. It's like a disaster plan, but it's smaller and it fits inside your pockets. It folds up. In fact, I have it right here. It is in small font. But what you do is you fill in the information and you keep it with you at all times. I always say that a disaster plan is not very useful. You want a working disaster plan, one that everybody knows what's in it and where it is, and it shouldn't only be inside your institution. Because if you are barred from going into your institution because of damage to the building, You still need to be able to look at your disaster plan to have phone numbers of people to call or outside assistance, and also to do contacts even within your institution, to call, to have a meeting place, to make up a plan and come up with how you're going to respond. So having this pocket response plan is very, very useful. Again, it's freely available for download, and then you can change it. You can change the categories to fit what you need for your response plan, to fill in for your agency, your civil defense, your fire department, and have the names and information right there so you are at the ready. Now, one of the things that happens when you are developing this pocket response plan that is built out of your emergency disaster plan is now we have to find out the phone numbers. We have to find out the contact people who we will call. And knowing those people ahead of time is so very important to have a good response plan. So the very act of filling in this pocket response plan ahead of time will work to your advantage because you will have made contact with the people you need to be able to call in the event of a disaster. And this small pocket plan is not, and the wheel are not replacements for your disaster plan, but they are wonderful enhancements. Now, with an emergency plan, we always have to prioritize. And prioritizing your collections is very important. But of course, the very first thing are people. You need to make sure that the people are safe. You have an evacuation plan in your facility to make sure that everyone has left the facility if there's a need for that. The second thing for an emergency plan where you need to prioritize is your facility itself. Is it secure? Do you know whether or not it is safe to go inside there? After an earthquake, after a fire, oftentimes it is the facility itself, you're barred from going in. Having a hard hat will sometimes help you get into a facility. If you have hard hats and appropriate protective clothing, that will often help with civil defense. And if they know that you've been trained because they're part of your training and they've been involved in the training, they are much more likely to let you go inside your facility to check on your collections. So why exercise? Well, exercise, of course, physical exercise is good for all of us. It shows us where our muscles are weak and where we need to improve. And the same is true for exercising a disaster plan. It helps you reveal weaknesses in your planning and gaps. It lets you see where there are resources that you might need to improve. It shows how to coordinate. And you may have one person who's in charge, but do you have a backup? What if that person is on vacation halfway across the world? Not now in the pandemic, understandably, people aren't traveling, but all of this is going to go, is going to change. We're going to have a new normal. And we will be able to be in close proximity again. Whether we're wearing masks or not is open to determination. But being able to know who's doing what and who have the roles and the responsibilities, who's coordinating the effort, and always having a backup person. Having a backup plan is always useful, but having backup staff to take over if somebody else is sick, is injured, then you need someone to be able to step in and take over for the coordination and the various responsibilities and roles that you have identified as being needed in the event of a disaster. Practice makes perfect. That's the saying. And certainly it is true that with exercising a possible response, it will improve the performance and also the confidence. The confidence of your staff in taking over and knowing next steps, of not having to, of being able to practice so that they don't have to be told every single thing to do in the event of the disaster, but rather that they are prepared and know what their next steps are, what they need to do to be part of the response effort. The other thing that is so important about exercising a disaster plan is that it brings together a cohesive management team. Now, it is the case, of course, that almost always after a disaster, you need resources, you need monetary resources, you need fiscal resources to provide for temporary storage, for packing materials, or shoring up a building, or any number of things that need to be done, maybe to hire temporary staff. But having a management team where that has been thought about ahead of time, and knowing who has the resources, the access to the budget or fiscal resources is very important to be part of your planning team. And now you've done your disaster plan, and now you've exercised it and you've practiced it, and you're feeling a confidence about should the disaster, or when the disaster happens, I should say, you will be able to bring in your team and do some response and recovery. But things change. Maybe you add some shelving. Maybe you put in a new storage facility. All of that needs to be added to the disaster plan. So it is always important to revise and update the plan at least once a year. And updating the plan can be done again as a team. What are the things that have changed? What is the newest thing that we need to think about? And the facilities and the cleaning people, all of those people, as well as the curators and the management, need to be part of not just the original planning, but the revision and the updating of the plan on a regular basis, at least once a year. So let's talk about what we're going to do for that exercise. So it's time now for everybody to put your arms up, wake up a little bit, move your head. If you've been looking at the monitor, turn away, look out at a distance. And now we've done a little exercise. And so to test our procedures for a true exercise for disaster planning, we'll want to think about the best way to do it. We want to learn from our mistakes. It's okay to make mistakes because you can learn from them. You want to teach success, not failure. And you want to build confidence. You don't want people to be scared to touch a wet book, for example. So there are various types of exercises, and I want to think briefly about the type of exercise for the type of disaster. So a tabletop exercise is a discussion where you think about what kind of disaster, and you have usually a scenario, and then you say, and the team comes together, how would we deal with this scenario? So one of the best ways to do a tabletop exercise is to have a worst case scenario. And that could be an earthquake. a flood, something that is going to be truly disastrous. It's something that we don't want to think about happening, but that because we've done our risk assessment, we know it could happen. We are in an earthquake zone. We are in a flood zone. We do have hurricanes or cyclones. We do have we're on a coast. We do have the possibility of a tsunami as a result of an earthquake in another area. So all of these are tabletop exercises that can be considered and thought about and come together as a team to come up with what are we going to do? Who are we going to call? Who can help us in surviving this disaster? And what will we individually do as part of the team to work together to mitigate the situation? Now, a functional exercise is actually hands-on activity where you practice. Well, that is probably not being done very much in this pandemic. I can imagine how it could be done with masks on, where you actually did some water recovery of materials or looked at putting up plastic sheeting and practiced that. If water coming in from above is one of the scenarios that is likely to happen that you found from your risk assessment. And then a full-scale exercise, a simulation, is something that takes a lot of planning and does require that people be working together. So again, the tabletop exercise is something that you could certainly do on Zoom, and the functional exercise could be something that could be done in small groups. So in thinking about training activities, one way to think about doing that is to include it in a regular departmental meeting. Maybe the first 10 minutes of a meeting. Where is the closest fire alarm, the fire extinguisher, the exit? For those of you who have not been able to be in your building for some time, remembering where everything is and having a map can be a very useful thing, so that when you first go back into your building, you are ready to start working in your space immediately. But just as important is remembering and familiarizing yourself with the layout of the building again. Knowing where the fire alarm is, the fire extinguisher, and the exits are all very important for personal safety. Now you've put together your team, and so it's important also to do some role playing. If you are the spokesperson, or if you are part of the management team, but what is needed is for you to do hands-on, that's where that role playing can fit in. Who's your backup? And let that backup person do some of the role playing. To look at an emergency notification system is an important piece. And that prep, that pocket planning can include those phone numbers. One of the things that's useful to do is to actually practice that. Call, know who is supposed to, if there's a phone tree where you're calling 2 or 3 people, those 2 or 3 people are calling 2 or 3 people, and actually practice it and actually do it. And make sure that all the phone numbers are still current and that no one has left the organization, and that your phone tree will continue to work. And you can do that phone exercise during the pandemic, certainly. Now, I suggested a fun activity like a scavenger hunt to find emergency supplies. And you could do that. within your own homes. What are some of the emergency supplies that you might have on hand that might be needed for your own home if you have a disaster that affects your home? And what are the procedures that you would go through? So you could be on a Zoom call and everyone's at home, and you could still be doing some training activities. Everyone could look for items that they have in their home that could be used for emergency supplies. Come together, bring those together, and talk about those on a Zoom call. How would that be used? What could that substitute for? These are all ways that you can keep the idea of emergency planning current in people's mind. It can be set aside, obviously, when other tasks have to be done. But you never want it to become so stagnant that people can't think out of the box for an emergency. And that's what these training activities are for. I like that idea of doing it in your home. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that later today. I'm going to think about the supplies that I have and make a list of them and share them with other staff. So now functional exercises are where you could bring in an expert, and you could again do this even if you're not in your facility, or if you have to, or if you have limited time in your facility. You could invite a speaker to talk about, an expert to talk about prevention and safety. You could think about a walk through the building. When the building's almost empty and you only have minimal staff because of social distancing, you can have them walk the building. Where are the emergency staircases if the elevators aren't working? And now you can think about how to do an evacuation drill. How quickly can you get out of the building? How long does it take? Time yourself. Developing an understanding of a plan and implementing it at every level of the institution, again, is something that can be done in a departmental meeting or a full staff meeting, and provide some, sometimes you can do it, you can do it in a fun way, like a scavenger hunt, or what would be the supply that you have in your office that could be used for an emergency, or within your department, or in your area. And if there are things that need to be distributed, such as plastic sheeting to protect from water, then that would be something that, well, we don't have any. Do you have extra? Can we start moving some of these things around? And who is going to track that and put that on a map so that you know what supplies you have and where they are? Very important, and can easily be done from a distance. So here's an example of a practice session. This picture is taken from before the pandemic, where plastic sheeting was pre-cut and was used over, in this case, it was a library, as you can see from the books on the shelving, but it could have been a museum shelving, where the plastic is rolled up so that it can be started from one side and pushed over across the top of the stack area to protect the materials on both sides, and still have your aisle free. So final words about training, not my final words, but final words about training. Let's see, we've been, okay. I have another 30 minutes. What you want to do is you do want to conduct training in response to what your most likely event is. And that and so think about that as you do your risk analysis. Don't just do evacuation drills. That's great for people. We want to get everybody out fast, and timing that is useful. Walk, don't run to your nearest exit. But you also want to train for the disaster exercise for the collections. How are you going to move collections? What are you going to do? You really want to test your preparedness for every type of event that you think could happen. When you look at what your risk is, and there are multiple risks always, then you want to be able to test your preparedness for all of those events. So what is your disaster personality? And each of us have. Do we panic? Do we want to be the hero? Do we want to gather together the forces? Are we calm? Are we in denial? Do we want to just delay? I so well remember it was a 3-day weekend holiday. The first day of that 3-day holiday, there was a water disaster in a university building that held both faculty offices, as well as a library. I was asked to come in and help. I did. And I was working in the faculty area, and a faculty member came in and unlocked his door to his office so that I could go in and see. And it had water everywhere. All of his books were soaked, his computer was soaked, and the notes beside his computer were all water damaged. He looked at it, just so happened it was a man, and he said, you know what? I don't want to ruin my weekend. I'm just going to close this door and not do anything. Talk about delay. Talk about paralysis. And I said to him, I said, if you wait 3 days, you're going to have mold, and it's going to be many times harder to save anything. How about if we work together just for an hour, and then you go and have your weekend, and you'll know that things are not, it won't prey on your mind. How about if we spend an hour together to see what we can do? He agreed to do that. It took more than an hour. He was not willing to stay the hour, but he was willing, after working with me for an hour, to let me finish the cleanup, which I did. So that when he came back after the holiday, he had much less to deal with than before. So what does that mean for me? That means that I'm calm, and that I'm resilient, and that I think about options. And why is that? Well, I've been 40 years, almost 40 years, dealing with disasters and helping with disaster recovery. So it's much easier for me. If it's the first time you've had a disaster, well, no wonder you'd want to delay the answer. No wonder that. So think about what your disaster personality is, and certainly with practice, you get better at it. I have a book that I don't usually recommend books, but I do have this book called The Unthinkable: Who Survives When Disaster Strikes. And this was done by Amanda Ripley. It's about 10 years old, I think. So relatively easy to find on the used book market. And what Amanda learned, what she did was she interviewed people who had lived through disasters, plane crashes, 9/11. This was mostly done in the United States, but not all. And what she did was, by interviewing these people who had lived through a horrendous disaster, she came up with personalities and actions. What is the way that you want to behave in a crisis? You want to stop and think, what do I need to do? And then you want to think about what is the next step. Do I want to evacuate out of the building? If you're in an earthquake and you're in a building, do you need to get out of the building? Generally, that's what's expected. You certainly don't want to take an elevator. You want to take the stairwell. So this book made me think about different things I wanted to incorporate into disaster planning. The story that I told you earlier about getting on an airplane and always knowing where the emergency exit is came out of this book, The Unthinkable. The people who lived through plane crashes were the ones who knew where the emergency exit were and went directly there. In an emergency, there are many reactions. When we have adrenaline immediately to help and work. Then, because the emergency goes on and on for the cleanup, for the response, you have to pace yourself. But often you become, different people have different reactions, but it becomes tiring, physically tiring and mentally tiring. And you need to also take care of yourself. Very important. Take care of yourself and your own disaster needs and those of your family, as well as then taking care of your institution. Yesterday, we heard about a director of a library whose son was killed, and she stayed in the library. Her son was killed documenting, this was in a war situation. And she stayed to protect her library collection. What a brave, brave woman she is. To have done that and to have valued her collection and her job, what she saw as her job that was more important than, in this case, her immediate family needs. Now, everybody doesn't need to do that. And I wouldn't expect that everybody would do that. But it is very important to think about what you need and how your physical strength and mental strength can be gauged. You need to check in with yourself and see what you need. And that is a very important piece. I give you a resource to the Red Cross that also shows, that has specifically about recovering emotionally. And our emotional response can be very, very energizing in the beginning because we have that adrenaline, and then we can just collapse. So we need to monitor our own needs and our own process to make sure that we take care of ourselves. Otherwise, we can't keep doing the response and the recovery. So we know that losses will occur. Even in spite of our best efforts, we're doing risk assessment, we're mitigating as much possibilities of damage that we can. We're maybe installing some of that wonderful equipment that Jerry Pondy talked about for museums for earthquake prevention, for storage and protection of materials. We maybe have opportunity to do all of our practice and to stay involved in the larger community and come together to work together for mutual aid, really, with civil defense, with the fire department, with police, and know that they are going to help us in a disaster to help our cultural heritage be preserved. So even after the loss, we have to stay involved. We have to look at recovery, restoration, and everything has to be documented. Take pictures. You've got probably a camera right there on your phone. Take pictures of the events. Document it. And you can tell the story afterwards. Very, very important. So fire can often be a total loss, but even here, it's not a total loss. Some of these materials could be restored. Very quickly, I'm going to tell you about a situation in 2004 when a flood went through a library. Now, in fact, the library had been built on an old, where the river had once been and had been redirected. And a huge rainstorm and the water the river revisited its old path and went right through the library. So the flood happened in 2004. It was 2010 when that library was again able to be opened. The basement of the building that was flooded was the map area, and some of those maps are still in freezers and being restored slowly over time. So don't give up. That's why I say pace yourself. Recovery, the restoration takes a long time. There's another wonderful, freely available video about water and emergency response with water. This is the American Institute for Conservation. Obviously, I'm using American resources that I'm aware of because that's what I'm most familiar with. And here's another one that's also available, Karen Pavelka, who just recently retired, but earlier made this wonderful resource here that's available on YouTube. There's an international standard. That's when the world agrees for the International Standard Organization, the ISO standards. And there's one that recently was approved on emergency preparedness and response. I recommend this one, which does cost money, but I recommend it because it has different stages of preparedness. So if you're a very small institution and have very few staff, what are the things that you need to do, as opposed to a state library that has many more people and probably has its own conservation preservation department. So it works in tiers based on the size of your institution for emergency preparedness and response. And that, I think, is useful worldwide. We have many, many different size institutions that hold cultural heritage. I'm working right now where there is one staff person and lots of volunteers. And in that case, the volunteers get training. And they agree to help in a situation. So I recommend this standard. And there are some other support information that is also useful for large-scale natural disasters. So you can have a small disaster, call in your mutual aid, other cultural heritage institutions that haven't been affected by the disaster because it's isolated either to your institution or to a smaller area. And if you develop a mutual aid agreement and to provide assistance outside of your general area, this can be extremely useful. Involve them in the training too with mutual aid. That can make training much more useful for all to be able to participate and learn. And then you're all on the same page. You all follow the same protocols, which is also very useful. So within the United States, we have an organization called the National Heritage Responders. Perhaps not surprisingly, I'm a member of that. We have a 24-hour call where we take turns over a month to answer the phone to provide assistance. And then we also do on-site recovery. Right now we're doing on-site video recovery, where somebody can walk through an area with their phone and show the damage, and then assessment and recommendations can be made by one of the National Heritage Responders. IFLA, the International Federation of Library Associations, also has cultural heritage training across regions. They have what are known as regional PAC centers, preservation centers, and those can be very helpful in terms of training and also providing expertise. And then, of course, UNESCO, which we've heard about both from UNESCO, ICOM, ICCROM, all working together internationally to help in large-scale disasters. So I want to thank you for your attention. This is the closing. I very much hope that I have energized you to take action.